We all need to be able to run this race together. Now, an important part of running a race is you need to start at the same starting line together. The problem is not all of society is at the same starting line. We've got some people who are in the stadium, they're behind the starting blocks, they're ready to run the race, they've had the training, they're ready to go, they're ready to set a world record. There's some people who are kilometers away from the stadium. They haven't had access to training or resources. And so for them to contribute to this global race, we're going to have to make sure they come into the stadium, they get the right kit, the right training, they can run alongside us. And for me, that's the most immediate global need, is to reconfigure global society so that we're all partners, that we are all equal, that we can have the same kind of aspirations and bring our individual skills to fulfilling those joint aspirations together. Yes, climate change is important. The loss of biodiversity is important. Development is important. But we are not going to sort out any of those problems until everyone can contribute. And currently, large portions of the world simply cannot contribute. Their skills, their knowledge, bring what they have to the table in a meaningful and equal way. And that has to be balanced. So we have to balance the societal scales in order to make the other sorts of societal momentum possible that allows us to work together to tackle climate change, biodiversity loss, poverty, development needs, and so on. So for me, the pandemic of inequity is something we've got to really put to the top of the political, economic, and social agenda. People on the ground are very well aware of the fact that the situation around them is changing. But because the existential crisis is meeting those societies first, the only realistic way to begin to have a broader global conversation about these challenges is if we draw development into the debate. People simply do not have the bandwidth for other discussions when you're wondering where the next meal comes from, whether you'll be able to secure health care for your sick child, if there's no water or no energy where you live. And so really an entree into a broader global discussion has to be accompanied by a strong development push. We cannot expect people who, because of the inequality in our society, have been pushed to the fringes of an economy which is unfair and where resources are unjustly exploited and unequally utilized, to take on some of these big challenges before those basic needs are met. So in many cases in the work that I do, I don't speak about biodiversity loss. I don't speak about climate change. What I do speak about is development, and we look for opportunities where we can draw those concerns around biodiversity and climate change into upliftment opportunities for communities in our city, be they urban, peri-urban, or rural. And once people have been reassured that a system is being created which is responsive to their needs, they become more willing to hear other conversations. So what does resilience mean for cities around the world? I'm certainly part of a group of people who don't believe that there's a one-size-fits-all toolbox that makes a city resilient. I think the beauty and challenge of cities lies in the fact that they respond to their contexts. So resilience in the city of Durban will be very different to what resilience means in Cape Town, what it might mean in Dar es Salaam, or in Addis Ababa, or in London, or in Shanghai. And I think the first tool in the toolbox of a resilient city is to be able to open a conversation with the residents of the city about what that term means. And you'll be surprised how many people, certainly in the city of Durban, were totally confounded by that term. It doesn't translate well into the vernacular. It seems foreign, and where does it come from? What does it mean? And I've certainly heard that from colleagues around the world, that the term is not a comfortable fit. It's not something we wear easily, and so we've got to do the hard work that allows us to understand what resilience means. We spent 2 to 3 years talking to the residents of Durban about the term of resilience, because we weren't going to parachute in the accepted definitions. And they took us on an incredibly interesting journey as we tried to make this term resilience fit within the Durban vernacular. And where our residents landed us is they said, look, we think, given where Durban is at this point, dealing with change, all sorts of change, is really where we need to be focusing this issue of resilience. We've got a country that's still going through this nation-building project after years of exclusive and inequitous development under an apartheid government. We've got change that's happening in our city as we reintegrate into the global society, and the city itself is changing. We've gone from a scenario in South Africa where, when we moved to democracy, the country at large had 200 to 300 informal settlements. Now our city alone has just under 600. So the city itself is changing. People are saying that this city doesn't work for us, and so we're going to build a city within a city to deal with those needs. And that's a very important call that we've got to listen to. So the first calling card for resilience in Durban is about dealing with change. And then when we had the discussion, well, we're a city with limited resources, both human, skills, financial. Where do you throw that pebble into the pond? Where are you going to get the most impact? And we had a very interesting discussion across facets of Durban society. And they landed us in places we never thought. They said there are 2 areas where we need to be able to change the status quo in order to create resilience. The first is dealing with informality, because it's such a growing pressure in the city, and it's such a challenge in terms of societal welfare, in terms of infrastructure provision. That's something we need to deal with. And if you deal with informality, you'll have a whole host of co-benefits that flow into the city at large. And then to deal with traditional governance, because we've got a city where we have a very Western type city hall government, but then we've got traditional government that is responsible for managing 40% of the city areas. So you've got traditional leaders who are also important decision makers in the planning of the city. And they said that dual governance system has to be dealt with. So it's very different to the type of resilience arguments you get at other cities which deal with floods and droughts and deal with disaster risk management. Our society pointed us essentially to governance issues as critical in dealing with them. And when we unpacked the informality aspect, what we unearthed there was we don't have enough data in a coordinated fashion that's accessible to allow us to deal with the needs of our informal settlement communities who are a part of African urbanization. We are not going to be able to move everyone from informal into formal. I think that's a pipe dream. But we need to understand that process of African urbanization through informality and be able to deal with it. But then you've got to know where people are, how many there are. And so we've been spending the last couple of years, ironically, dealing with data management, which seems to be a fundamental flaw. So for Durban, a lot of these issues are focused around governance, around who holds political power, around these issues of planning and management in the city, around the issues of informality, which is quite different to the resilience narratives that you get out of many cities, which are disaster risk reduction and management related. So, the toolbox for every city from a resilience point of view will be very diverse and has to be based on a local conversation. So the question is, how do we get everyone in a city together, talking to agree on what the priorities are and what they can contribute? To my mind, this is where local government plays a critical convening role. It has the power and resources to make available a safe space for very different stakeholders to come to the table, be it the local chamber of commerce, be it leadership from informal settlements, leaderships from environmental NGOs, politicians who be responsible for running the city, people within the city administration. And so for me, using the convening power of local government is a critical tool that we have in the toolbox, because it has the ability to pull people into a room to have these discussions. But we have to be mindful of very practical things about where do you hold the meetings? Who has access? If they don't have access, are you going to be providing transport? What times of the day do you hold your meeting? Because that excludes a vast number of people. And so ensuring that we have meetings in different places at different times. And also bringing in neutral facilitators to help with discussions. Because while we might assume that local government has a really important role to play, and it does, there are many people in society who simply don't trust government. And so very often having a neutral voice in the conversation is important. One hard lesson we have learned is if you're going to do the hard work of convening a conversation is merely the start of a much longer dialogue between yourself and various other groups. And so it's important that these conversations continue through time. And I think that's a really important commitment, and that's where local government has a very, very valuable role. It has a much longer lifespan than various societal groups may have, where leadership may come and go, where funding may come and go, businesses change, business leadership changes. And so local government has the ability to be the custodian of the city-level conversation. By making available opportunities to voice opinions and to be heard and to see that you are being heard in terms of the decisions that are taken, one can slowly build trust between very divergent groups. And when people are in the same room, even though they may come from very different parts of the community, when you see your fellow resident, regardless of where they come from, and you spend 1 or 2 hours talking with them, share a supper after an evening meeting, it begins to break down the stereotypes. It begins to break down the barriers. And so some of this stuff is not high tech. It's fundamentally about providing opportunities to rebuild human relationships and conversations that have been broken by law, by inept policy, by unequal economic systems, in order to bring those diverse views together. And there's no need for everyone to agree on everything, but the fact is people can hear differences, and that informs their own thinking and allows us to move forward in a new way, because then we can decide where to put our pipes in a way that makes someone's life different and improve. We can decide what decisions are best made to benefit the majority of the people in the city. We can decide which plans are responsive to the diverse needs that we've heard about. And so for me, very often I think we're looking for some very complex solution to these problems. And it's really about rebuilding the societal fabric in many ways, because that creates a more equal conversation. And it makes a local government more connected to its local population. But then that local government can connect to other local governments through international networks. So we can hear our own local conversation, but we can benefit from the conversations being held elsewhere in the world to see how they may have tackled similar problems and bring that information back. So it also becomes an important way of information sharing. And so it's less about setting up effective local government and more about local government allowing more participative governance by everyone in the city. So the fact that everyone should have the right to the city and the right to decide what that city does, I think is a fundamental principle. Hard to achieve, difficult to sustain, but really critical if cities are going to become these dynamos of change that we need to create the global societal energy that will drive us onto a different development path.